Okay, hi, good evening, everyone. Assalamualaikum. Thanks everyone for joining us on this IDS webinar tonight on the topic of the treatment of non-citizens during COVID-19. So as I think all of you know, IDS is doing a series actually of webinars on how the country has tried to adapt to COVID-19 and also how the government has implemented their policies throughout this critical period. And tonight we are joined by two great panelists, Dr. Andika Abdul Wahab from the Institute Kajian Malaysia dan Antarabangsa, UKM, and also Lilian Fan, who is the chairman of the, sorry Lilian, could you just tell me how to pronounce your the foundation's name?
Gutanio Foundation.
Gutanio Foundation, yes. And our two panelists will share different perspectives on the treatment of non-citizens tonight, and we will try and consolidate some of their opinions to see how the landscape has actually materialized throughout COVID-19. But I think one of the purposes of this webinar is also to seek some clarification actually on how refugees and migrant workers actually treated during the MCO, and what's the what's the progress currently, and also how as a country did COVID-19 actually sort of it revealed, I think, a lot of things about how we treat non-citizens in our country. But I think it also serves, I think, as a reminder for all of us and how important it is, for us to pay attention, I think, to these issues more closely. So I think, Lilian, I think we can start with you. And during the MCO, I think in the news we were just we were given images and also some videos of how the refugee crisis was managed, I think, during MCO. And I think, we would like to actually ask you and for you to provide some clarification, actually. How much were refugees actually protected during the MCO? What was the situation they were in? And also you could share with us some of the work that you did with them. Over to you.
Thank you, Ira. Thank you so much for inviting me to this talk. I think that we need to actually look at the diversity of measures that were taken during the MCO and how those impacted the refugee population. And also we need to look at the different types of refugees who we have in the country and the groups who actually had tried to arrive during the time of the MCO. Because there was a very different response, I think, that we could see from the authorities and also from communities and citizens. I think to say, first of all, the official response, the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic was initially framed in a very inclusive way. There was a directive from the Ministry of Health in the early days that testing, treatment, screening was really for everyone, that there was no discrimination between whether somebody was a citizen or not. And they didn't single out refugees in any way, but they did make it clear that, citizenship wasn't going to be an issue of gaining access to screening, testing, and treatment if one was tested positive, that would be done, through the government facilities free of charge. And that was inclusive. And I think that was a really good measure to come from the government because, ultimately when you're dealing with a public health crisis, and of course, even more so in a pandemic of such, scale and such seriousness as COVID-19, what you really do need is a response that doesn't draw boundaries, right, according to, people's immigration status or citizenship, because obviously a virus doesn't know those boundaries, and a virus will affect everyone. And, once a particular community is at risk, it puts the rest of us all at risk. So that was a really good approach, I think, that we need to acknowledge from the outset. And I think what we saw then was that as the clusters started to emerge, there were certain clusters where migrants and refugees were implicated as well. And I think the first one, and the most important one, I think, that kind of defined a bit of the response was the Tabligh cluster. And in the Tabligh cluster, you know, there was obviously this panic about trying to trace all of the people who had been there and their contacts. And then it became clear that not only was it an international conference where you had, you know, lots of people from many different countries attending, there were also actually a lot of non-citizens who were living in Malaysia who had attended that gathering. And many of them included people who were non-documented, right? So it included certain populations of undocumented migrants, and it also included certain populations of refugees. And that's, I think, where there started to, you know, you started to see in the media some, I wouldn't call it blame yet, but there was some speculation of, you know, the numbers and this kind of insinuation that certain groups of refugees, and of course, you know, they would all talk about the Rohingya. The Rohingya were, you know, participating on a large scale in this Tabligh cluster. This was the rhetoric that started to emerge in the media, and that they couldn't be traced and there was difficulty, you know, with them coming forward. It wasn't really the case because, in fact, the numbers of Rohingya were much lower than some of the other migrant groups. You did have Rohingya there, but, you know, what was clear then was that it also wasn't about the unwillingness of refugee populations or undocumented populations to come forward for health reasons. It was actually, any hesitation had to do with the fact that they were not confident that they wouldn't be penalized for their immigration status, right? So that started to become quite clear. And there was actually a lot of work that took place between UNHCR, NGOs, the government, and refugee-led organizations as well to, number one, identify those people who had participated in the gathering, so who might have been infected, and also to communicate to the National Security Council and the other parts of the government to say that, you know, the messages that are really needed at this point to reach out to that community are guarantees of, you know, not being penalized for immigration status. And in fact, we saw then our senior minister and defense minister, you know, came out and actually made a very clear statement. You know, we're not prioritizing arresting anybody for coming forward, you know, because of immigration status. Actually, what we really prioritize now is the health, the public health issue. So please don't hesitate to come forward. And once that message came out, you actually did see a lot of people from the Myanmar Muslim community, for example, who are not Rohingya. They are citizens of Myanmar who are of the Muslim faith. And many of them started to come forward because they had attended in quite large numbers. And members of the Rohingya community also started to come forward because they felt that they actually were, you know, had a level of protection. So I think that early stage of that response, you know, in this type of approach was actually a very good one. And then I think two things happened. I mean, one thing is we started to see, you know, even in late March and then early April, we started to see boats of Rohingya refugees who were, you know, arriving from Cox's Bazar, actually. And, you know, Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, of course, is the place that received hundreds and thousands of Rohingya refugees from Rakhine State, from northern Rakhine State, back in 2017, 2018, when, you know, mass atrocities were really accelerating and intensifying in Rakhine. And therefore, there was this huge number of people who went over. So many of those people have started to lose hope in the fact that they can return to Rakhine, because the situation in Rakhine is getting much worse for everyone, not just for the Rohingya, but there's actually an intensifying civil war that's going on there. So in fact, you know, this boat movement that you started to see, these very dangerous, irregular movements carrying, you know, Rohingya refugees, that started to emerge on our shores. And I think the response to that was, you know, obviously one where it was a bit mixed up with, you know, a fear of COVID, but it was more than that. It was a lot more about, you know, this attitude of really wanting to protect our borders, making sure that, you know, we had a very strict approach. And that's when you started to see messages, I think, first of all, from the government, you know, making it clear that we're not ready to receive any more Rohingya refugees. And there was a discussion about, can we send these people back to Bangladesh? So that was one thing. And then you started to see, I think what was much more disturbing was a xenophobia campaign that was very, very targeted against the Rohingya, and, you know, quite deliberate. And you can see that it was actually very orchestrated. You know, petitions that started popping up you know, on many different online petition sites, Change, Avaz, and, you know, lots of others, that were really basically stigmatizing and portraying the Rohingya in an extremely bad light, extremely derogatory light, making a lot of false accusations. And that seemed to be a real turning point that generated, you know, a lot of misconception and has generated, you know, to be frank, a lot of hate speech and discrimination against the Rohingya population. So this was a real shift. And I have to say that, you know, that's not something obviously that was, you know, deliberately coming from the government, but I think then it has been reinforced by some of the government policies, which have been then, have moved much more, not so much against refugees, but much more, you know, focusing on undocumented workers, undocumented migrants, and making sure that, you know, these operations that are happening against undocumented migrants, that has fed into misconceptions about refugees. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that people don't know the difference. You know, most Malaysians actually don't know that there's a difference between an undocumented migrant and a refugee. And I think the second issue is, you know, a lot of, there's this perception that you blame the undocumented migrant for being undocumented, when in fact, many people, even if they come as a migrant, many people fall into a state of being undocumented because they're cheated, because, you know, of many levels of abuse. But, you know, just to focus on refugees, I think the biggest problem is that they're being mixed up with this definition. So because we don't have refugee policy, there's been this tendency to label refugees, and particularly the Rohingya, as PATI, right, as pendatang asing tanpa izin, which makes it very difficult, you know, in communities when you're living next to a Rohingya family, and then suddenly you don't know, or you might be renting your apartment to a Rohingya family, and then suddenly you don't know if that's legal anymore. So you've seen actually, you know, evictions taking place in certain areas, including places like Selayang, even some places outside of Kuala Lumpur, you've seen that as well, such as in Bagan in Perak, and certain other areas. So it has had an impact, I would say. But I would also say that, you know, I don't think it's just a closed story. I mean, I think, you know, these are things that have happened, but I do think that there's a much more complex picture behind it. And I do think there's a lot of space to engage Malaysians at many different levels, you know, from the authorities to civil society, to, you know, educate more, and also try to actually have a proper dialogue about what is the best approach that we can have when it comes to managing the refugee situation here in Malaysia.
Okay, thanks, Lilian. I just want to pick up on some of the points that you brought up, right? So you mentioned that it seems like the government kind of went it was a good start. You know, the government said that, you know, we will not arrest anyone, so please come and, you know, don't be afraid to be tested and all that. But it seems like the turning point was, you know, when the refugee boats started to arrive, right? And then where we saw the sort of quite a targeted xenophobic campaign. But I'm just a bit curious, because I feel like xenophobia against the other is not, of course, it's not a new thing in Malaysia, but I feel like there is actually a genuine challenge, right, during a crisis time like the MCO, COVID, where you know, there is a need to of course, you know, protect whoever it is that is currently in Malaysia from, you know, being further infected, and from the infection to spread even further. To balance that also with you know, genuine humanitarian concerns, where you know, of course, you know, we should not you know, turn away those who need our help and who come to our shores because they have no other place to go. So I'm wondering if you could share with us if there is any sort of best practices, or you know, what actually, how do governments actually respond to this dilemma, I would say.
Well, I think we can just look across the shores actually and take a look at, you know, what's happening in Aceh in Indonesia, and I think there you see a community. I mean, obviously the government of Indonesia, you know, has a lot of challenges as well, particularly with COVID right now. You know, their infection rate is extremely high, and they are struggling, you know, with the resources to, you know, contain the pandemic. They obviously have a lot of concerns about COVID-19 and about the economy, you know, the same concerns that we have obviously here in Malaysia. But yet they've taken in 2 boats. I mean, we've taken in boats as well. You know, it's not to say that we actually ended up pushing all the boats away. We did push some, but we didn't actually push all. But the approach has been very different. You know, here I think, you know, when we did finally disembark a few boats, it was with great reluctance, and it was done in such a way that, you know, we've basically detained people and we haven't allowed access to UNHCR. And I think, you know, as long as we don't have a refugee policy ourselves in Malaysia, and it doesn't just mean signing the convention, it could mean coming up with domestic policy that is much more suited to our condition, which is in some ways aligned to the convention, but in other ways perhaps, you know, less so. But we don't have that, you know. So in the absence of that, the key international organization that offers international protection, that has the mandate to do so, is UNHCR. And therefore, you know, the logical thing to do would actually be to accelerate that access, right? So the government, you know, shouldn't be the one to be burdened with, you know, determining status. And, you know, the only agency that has the expertise and the mandate to do that in the absence of a government framework is UNHCR. So what should happen and what can happen is actually disembarkation and then quicker access to UNHCR, which is what Indonesia has done. So in the Indonesian case, I think it's extremely unique as well, but it's also something to learn from. I mean, there, you know, you have usually, when a boat would arrive in the waters of Aceh, it's the fishermen who come across the boat first. And the fishermen in Aceh have a very strong adat. They have a very strong tradition, customary law called Hukum Adat Laud, which they've been practicing for hundreds of years, which really gives them this obligation of saving life at sea, any life at sea, whether, you know, not looking at religion, not looking at background, and even if it's an animal in distress at sea, they have an obligation to rescue that living creature. And they really take that seriously. So there have been numerous times, you know, more than 25 times over the last 10 years, when boats have come up, whether it's Rohingya refugees or Iranian sailors or Tamil refugees, you know, back during the Sri Lanka conflict. And the fishermen have been the first ones to do the first response and go out and rescue these boats. Then when they come to shore, it's always a bit of a negotiation that takes place, you know, with the immigration, you know, obviously, which is a Jakarta level agency, but also the local authorities. And the local authorities usually in Aceh, in the Kabupaten level or the province level, have been very welcoming for the most part as well. And then it's a question about the resources, you know, how do we maintain this group of people? They're obviously much smaller numbers in Indonesia than we have here, but the welcome has been extraordinary, you know, especially from the Acehese people and government. And then what you have, I think, which is a very important thing to learn from, is this quick access to the agencies which are responsible and which can help the government, you know, and so that the government actually doesn't need to spend its own resources. You know, when HCR comes in, they do the status determination. Obviously, you know, the police and immigration and the authorities from the government are there as well to also take down the data, which is important, but they do so hand in hand with the international agencies. And then the NGOs are also there to support, right? So currently in Aceh, you've had this boat, you know, that just arrived on the 7th of September with 297 Rohingya refugees. And they're in extremely, you know, very severe conditions because they've been at sea for 7 months. Many are extremely weak. You know, there's no way that the government of Aceh would be able to respond to the needs of all those people, even though they are trying. Many have been, you know, admitted to hospital. But the resources then are being shared across the international organizations, the local NGOs, including our NGO, which is in Aceh. Gatanu is actually an Acehese word. We're, you know, first based in Aceh, then secondly here. So it's a collective response. And I think that that's something which, you know, it would be great if we could start to see that type of partnerships, you know, that kind of partnership approach being built here, so that the government doesn't feel that it needs to respond to all of this alone. You know, there are organizations, there are UN agencies, there are NGOs who are professional and ready to help on these issues in a very collaborative way. So I think there are ways of managing this that can be learned from.
Okay, thanks, Lilian. That's really fascinating. I mean, just to hear about this sort of multi-stakeholder coordination, cooperation that happens between you know, all levels, I think, from the authorities to civil society to even, you know, to down to the fishermen who who are actually kind of the first responders, I would say, to the boats that come in. So yeah, I mean, that's really interesting, and I think that's something that we probably should be moving towards in Malaysia. Thank you so much. Andika, I think turning to you now, I think I would like to now touch upon the topic of migrant workers, because as we all know, there was the famous, or rather maybe infamous, Al-Jazeera documentary where allegedly, or the Malaysian government claimed that misrepresented how migrant workers were treated during the MCO. And I mean, the nature of their jobs, these so-called 3D dirty dangerous jobs, obviously causes many of our migrant workers to be very vulnerable. And I'm just quoting here from our Minister of Defense, Dato Sri Ismail Sabri, who claimed that the government actually treated every foreigner equally. But then he also said something quite funny, which was, he said the people wanted the government to be firm on those who did wrong. And I think this was in response to that Al Jazeera documentary. And Dr. Andika, maybe you can share with us, I think, some of your research or some of your work on, on this balance between, again, this balance that I was touching upon with Lilian, which is, the balance between sort of protecting Malaysians from the spread of COVID, but at the same time, acknowledging that, we have a significant migrant worker population that is very vulnerable to infectious diseases such as COVID-19. Over to you, Andika.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you, Ira. First of all, thank you for inviting me to share thoughts on this topic. Maybe I don't know where should I start, but I guess I I could actually pick up somewhere from what already being shared by Lilian. I guess Lilian has a lot of experience in that area and expertise as well. And before answering your question specifically, I guess I should pick up some of this. And I also in agreement that there's a bigger problem that we facing now, society as large. Yeah, I mean, I'm not only talking about the government. I guess we're talking also about the society as a whole, on the misconception and misunderstanding, and that creates havoc and mixing up every non-citizen as party. And I think I need to just raise the point about conscious about the concept and terminologies around non-citizens. I don't think the intent is to put people into boxes, but I guess I mean, we have to be conscious about the concept because they have different motives of migration. I guess you, Lilian, surely know about the motives of migration, especially among the refugees, asylum seekers, but also different motive, especially for economic migrants when they come to Malaysia, right? And also the fact that different segments of non-citizens would have different would require different kind of protection. And I'm not saying that, I'm not contesting the idea of universalism, but I guess that how it is, because that would also have implication to policy that we are designing or refreshing in our country. So I think number one is conscious about the concept and terminologies when we refer to economic migrant, refugees, asylum seekers, stateless people, or maybe migrant workers that are becoming undocumented because of many reasons. Maybe they're just, coming in Malaysia regularly, or maybe some are coming into Malaysia irregularly or using irregular channel, and that's how they become undocumented. I guess the second point about the statistic, before I answer your question about statistic, I guess it's quite important as well. I mean, you also probably aware that we have the estimate between between I guess 3 and 5 million of non-citizens in Malaysia, both documented and undocumented migrants, including perhaps refugee population. I guess less than 200,000, 200 registered. It doesn't include the one that is not registered, or individual who wish to get the registration to be application to be to be registered, but didn't have the chance to do so with the UNHCR office. But I guess as you can also, because the estimate is quite problematic, because if you don't have figures, credible sources that to put how many actually non-citizens, that would create a lot of uncertainty not only from the policy making perspective, I guess, also at the society at large. So if you can actually look at, there was a study, if I'm not mistaken, done by Lee Hock On and another scholar, was published by ISIS Singapore last year, if I'm not mistaken. They're saying about between 3.85 million to 5.5 million of migrants in Malaysia. So it's a huge number. So I guess number also adds value to what is actually happening now in terms of misconception and understanding. And I guess the third point also relates to your question about the treatment of migrant workers specifically in Malaysia. I guess even before the COVID-19, we already aware that migrant workers are already vulnerable, and some at risk of exploitation, some at risk of irregularity, and some at risk of manipulation by not only by the labor agents during the recruitment process, in fact when they arrive in Malaysia by the employer. And there were also reports reporting on the manipulation and exploitation, including perhaps extortion by the enforcement personnel. If you don't like the external sources, we can always refer to national institutions like Human Rights Commission Malaysia, Suhakam. I guess the same extent of exploitation facing migrant workers. So some migrant workers already in debt bondage, paying high cost of their migration to come to Malaysia. And some are actually workers, working in the forced labor conditions where their passport being returned by the employer. And also you also aware that even before COVID-19, workers already living in poor living condition. I guess we can easily find it in news that migrant workers living in overcrowded, lack of proper sanitation. Some of them having limited or no access at all to healthcare services because of many reasons. Could be language barrier, could be the cost is double as compared to Malaysian, and also some of them being afraid to go to hospital or clinic because of their status of migration is irregular. So I guess even before COVID, we have issue with estimate. We also have issue with the concept, and we also know that the situation among the migrant workers before COVID make them even vulnerable when the COVID outbreak happens in Malaysia, when it started February or end of January. So what is your question again? So whether this is, can you repeat that question again?
Yes, my it's okay. My question was, what could the government have done better in balancing, the need to protect, of course, Malaysians from, further being affected by COVID, but also balance that with the need to protect, vulnerable communities, including migrant workers. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's the key aspect when we talk about policy response when it comes to migrant workers. I guess these are the three issues that stuck the government Malaysia to treat the migrant workers even better during the COVID-19. Nothing much the government can do unless you start treating the migrant workers. Because when we talk about the outbreak, we are talking about the vulnerability as well as the resilience. So if they are already in that situation, it's difficult. So the question about balancing between security and welfare, I guess my only concern is about when the arrest and doing the arrest and detention. I guess my point is that it is, of course, the duty of the state to protect its citizens. Of course, that's clear. And including safeguarding our borders, ensuring no trespassing of individuals without proper documentation. And there's a risk about bringing the COVID-19. That is clear. That is the role of the state. I guess no one would contest that. And the second point is that it's also the duty of the state to ensure workers have valid travel and working documents and to conduct raids and maintain detention center. This is the role of the state. So it's obvious. And this needs to be handled, of course, in accordance to the laws with compassion, orderly and respect to human rights. But the only problem is that why arrest and detain during MCO? That was problematic for me, because if you are keeping the border safe for new people coming in because you're afraid of the risk, then I guess it should be justified. This is my personal opinion. It may be justified, but I think for arresting people already in Malaysia, I think that would be problematic, because if you do that, from the operational point of view, you can't control the crowd during the arrest. And of course, this will involve huge number of people. And this is like an open social gathering. It's like a physical distancing is almost impossible in that situation. That's number one. Number two, when you do arrest and detention, and it actually discourages migrants, as already highlighted by Lillian, without documents, especially the one that without documentation, to come forward for COVID-19 testing. And this is in contradiction with the MOH advice in also end of January. And the third point, we already know that immigration detention facilities often in overcrowded situations with poor sanitations. I think you can find it very easily in SWACAM's inquiry and reports from international organizations. Not only that physical distancing is impossible, once you get infected in detention, it may spread out very easily. So these three reasons only can question why there is a need to arrest and detention during MCO. So, especially for those already in Malaysia. So that was problematic to me.
Okay, thanks, Anika. I think, yeah, all these points you shared also reminded me of another. I would say, it seemed like a knee-jerk reaction, which is, I think, in early July, there was a ban from the Selayang market, the wholesale market for migrants, a ban on migrants, right, to enter the Selayang wholesale market. And there were news reports that these migrant traders then set up shop outside the market instead, because obviously they need to sell their goods and they need an income. So yeah, I mean, I'm wondering, I'm wondering why these knee-jerk reactions continue to be done by the government, when actually there is, I think there is room to as I think Lillian also shared, to actually collaborate and cooperate with civil society organizations as well, who is working on these issues. Yeah, and it seems like not allowing them to enter the market sort of just exacerbates the problem, not only not only during a COVID time, but if you take away the source of livelihood for such a large group of people, then that could also lead to other problems, right? So yeah, maybe just share some of your thoughts on that.
Lillian or me?
Andika, sorry, yes.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I guess this is my observation throughout the course of the pandemic and the way that government responded. I'm not criticizing government, because I'm also a government servant, technically, because with public university. But I guess there's obvious lack of leadership. So there was a confusion who should make a call on certain things, right? So sometimes the MOH, sometimes the security cluster related minister, and then sometimes the wilayah, Menteri Wilayah, the minister of, especially on the market and in Selayang and all that. So there were a bit of problem with the leadership when announcing certain policy review or policy announcement, and there's also a lack of coordination among different agencies. So I guess these two quite obvious during the course of the pandemic. Other than that, I guess, I mean, go back to the conception. I guess the problem with our I don't know what is in terms of the structure, but I guess still National Security Council who is making decision on issues related to refugees. But I guess for migrant workers, supposed to be Ministry of Home Affairs. So there's a clear boundary in terms of making decision from the top. But again, I guess there's still misconception among the, I don't want to say this, but again, it's quite a fact that it's misconception not only at the media level, society level, but certain extent to the policy making. So mixing up everything. So when you talk about migrant workers, or sorry, refugees not allowed to work. So you don't mix up with undocumented migrant workers, because undocumented migrant workers, you can still rehire them. You can create a rehiring program, bring them to match them with the employer. You still can legalize them in terms of the documentation. But refugees is another story. So refugee, another story. So meaning that you have to, escalate the conversation about having them into the market, labor market. So I guess still back to the conception, and of course, because of there's no policy as mentioned by Lillian, I think this is the whole lot of the problem actually derives from there. We don't know where to go. So when something happens, there's no direction. Of course, direction is not there. Guidance is not there. We don't know what to do. We all based on humanitarian aspect. And when you say that you follow the humanitarian aspect, it can change anytime. I mean, yesterday I'm in good mood, I'm saying this. Tomorrow I'm bad mood, I'm saying different story. So there's no guidance. So I guess the policy as well is important. I don't think we need to wait to ratify the convention and then have it something concrete in terms of the administrative framework. I guess it can be done without ratifying convention, but of course, in the long run, we would encourage the country to ratify convention.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andika. I will get back to you actually, because I have a question about this documentation issue. But before that, Lillian, maybe you could just share some of your thoughts as well about this, about this what I thought was quite a strange rule by the Minister of Federal Territories on the sort of banning of migrant workers, because it's the Selayang wholesale market, and I know that you do quite a lot of work in Selayang with refugees. I'm wondering if there is a refugee population who works in the Selayang wholesale market as well. Lillian?
Yes, thanks, Ira. Yeah, I mean, this issue in Selayang, I have to say, I think there were a lot of concerns from the local community and issues of insecurity about, the livelihood situation, which of course is generally the situation in Malaysia right now and in many parts of the world. This feeling of economic insecurity, which has been impacted by COVID. So that's not unique. But I think what was unique about what we saw in Selayang was that the insecurity kind of got blamed on migrants and refugees, and I think that again, as Dr. Andika is saying, it's really because of the lack of policy. I mean, it's I would be one of the first people to admit that precisely because of lack of policy, because of the long lack of policy for so many years, there are real issues and grievances that have emerged in local communities, right? And I think we can't ignore that. And I think it is extremely important to address them. We really need to get to a point where we are able to sit down within an entire community in all its diversity, not just bringing, diverse Malaysians together, but also diverse non-citizens together, whether they be migrants or refugees or undocumented or documented or whatever, or stateless. I think we need to come to terms with reality of, very diverse populations living, especially in the urban areas, side by side, sharing a space and sharing an economic landscape. And I think, the Ministry of Federal Territories has taken an approach which is very much in a way to protect citizens' livelihoods, but I think they're doing it in a way where it's not very well planned, and it's also ignoring the fact that you actually have people who are very integrated into a community and embedded in a community who are suddenly going to lose livelihoods, and that can actually lead to a lot of problems as well. So unless you do a restructuring in a coordinated way and in a planned way, it's going to be very disruptive. And I think having that type of disruption where you are impacting, people's livelihoods and actually, I wouldn't say directly evicting, from the residential areas, because it wasn't the government evicting, but it was landlords who were very much encouraged by, or even afraid of, continuing to rent their properties out to, people who didn't have citizenship and people who didn't have documentation, including UNHCR cardholders, precisely because of the warnings and the notices that were coming up. It created an environment where nobody felt that they could take that risk anymore. I understand that obviously the unemployment rate is going up. We do need to look at restructuring the entire economy, but that needs to be done holistically. You know, you're not going to solve the unemployment problem by, you know, just targeting a few wholesale markets and, you know, kicking out the migrants and bringing, you know, local youth in. That's not going to solve your problem, right? You really need to have a much broader strategy for poverty reduction, for youth employment, you know, for training, for all of those types of things. And that's not something that can happen overnight. And I think that it's a little bit, you know, the impact, the consequences, the negative consequences that have been seen, you know, as a result of those types of responses have been, you know, have been far-reaching. There've been a lot of families, a lot of individuals who are already very vulnerable, who've become more vulnerable, who've been evicted. At one point, you had, you know, hundreds of individuals who were evicted and were literally running to, you know, NGO offices and schools and UNHCR offices and camping outside and not having anywhere to go. And, you know, just as we were all starting to wind down in our food package responses, you know, the kind of emergency MCO responses, suddenly we were receiving requests again from UNHCR, can you support 80 families here, you know, for 1 week, can you support? And we don't have the resources for that. So it's stretching everybody's resources in a way that's completely unplanned. And I think that, you know, if we're really going to manage this crisis together, and I mean the, you know, the COVID crisis and the crisis of, you know, a vulnerable economy, you know, making sure that there's a way that everybody can thrive and survive under very difficult conditions, you know, you need to do that in a way that doesn't exclude people deliberately and doesn't make vulnerable people more vulnerable, because that just makes all of us, it puts all of us at much more risk. So, you know, but having said that, I think the issue of dialogue, so I think actually being able to sit down and bring local communities together with refugee communities, together with the service providers, whether they're from the government or from non-governmental organizations, and come up with plans for communities, you know, actually come up and talk about joint plans, making sure everybody knows what services are available, making sure people know where the gaps are, and making sure the communities understand each other. You know, they don't always speak the same language. So, you know, why don't we make sure that we have services which provide language classes that could also provide jobs for locals, teach languages, you know, teach the local languages to the refugee population, to make sure that, you know, they know how to communicate with us in a very clear way. Teaching culture, I think this is another thing that we could learn from the Achenese. You know, back in 2015, when there were thousands of Rohingya refugees who arrived in Aceh, the Aceh government organized monthly cultural meetings, basically, and cultural events to basically share cultural, you know, Achenese culture and Indonesian law as well with the Rohingya refugees, so that they would understand what is Aceh Adat, you know, what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. And it was done in a very local level, you know, with all the Ketua Kampung coming and the local schools getting involved, you know, coming and showing Achenese dances, teaching them Achenese language and some of the Adat, teaching them Achenese cooking. It was really done in a way that, you know, they were being treated like they were guests of Aceh, and they should learn the culture of Aceh, and they should respect the culture of Aceh. And we've never done that, you know, in Malaysia, because we've never had an official policy, you know, that acknowledges that, in fact, we have refugees here. And in fact, we are, I wouldn't say receiving, but we are accepting, at least in providing some temporary shelter for refugees. So I think until we take this issue seriously enough that we are developing policies and programs at the community level, we're going to continue to see this type of, you know, these kinds of misconceptions and knee-jerk policies.
Yeah, I really like this idea of sort of cultural meetings and learning language, because I feel like a lot of the talk or a lot of the rhetoric that surrounds you know, refugees and migrant workers, you know, because, you know, we tend to see them as this whole group of people who are demanding things, right? And we fail to see them as individuals with stories and families and real you know, fears and hopes and dreams, right? And I completely agree with you. Those you know, seeing people as individuals can only happen if you interact with them on an individual level. So it's actually quite a micro thing, like, you know, because we always talk about you know, needing to put in place policies, but also I think you know, a part of how you solve the problem is actually quite on a micro scale, which is on you know, individuals interacting with other individuals. And um, are there, I'm just curious, are there any NGOs in Malaysia, or maybe your foundation, do you sort of try and stimulate some of these relationship building between Malaysians and also refugee communities?
Yeah, this is actually our priority this year. So we've got a program this year, which is just about to start. Actually, it's been, you know, really delayed by the MCO and all of this. But starting from next month, we're going to be rolling out a program which is targeting 5 states, and we are actually going to be facilitating this kind of, you know, coming together of local communities with refugee communities, and really, I think, number one, giving each side a chance to just talk, just to do that, you know, the active listening to each other, and not, you know, saying anything's wrong, but really just allowing people to air all the grievances, taking note of them, mapping out what the issues are, and then trying to come to solutions together, trying to come to more understanding together. I mean, I think it's, and the learning is on both sides. It's not just Malaysians who have to learn, it's also refugees who have to learn, you know, and we've realized many times that sometimes the interpretation, you know, that refugees would have, particularly the Rohingya community, because they've had less access to education. They've been in much more of a, you know, really desperate survival mode for so many years, and from many of the places where they get displaced to, you know, from Rakhine to Bangladesh, conditions in Bangladesh are also very desperate. So, you know, they are in this mode where there's a kind of, they're really driven by this sort of, you know, survival mentality. And that needs to change too. So I think if, when they're here, you know, and when we engage them with dignity and with the level of respect, then, you know, we need to relate to them that we expect the same from them, you know, that we also expect to be treated. And the Rohingya understand this, because, I mean, I've done a study, I'm an anthropologist by training, and I did this really interesting study once, which was looking at the question of dignity, the topic of dignity and what that means to the Rohingya. And even in the Rohingya language, you know, there's a particular term for it, which is a very relational term. And when we asked about, I think it was about 85 Rohingya to explain to us, you know, what their concept of dignity was, give us examples, when do you feel dignified? Everything had to do with the way they were being treated and the way they were treating others. So that's something that's ingrained, you know, they do understand that. And I think a lot of it is about that engagement, you know, really taking the time and sitting down with people, getting to know each other, making them feel safe, you know, so that they don't feel like they're always running away from immigration officers, you know. And I think when there's that level, you know, they'll be more willing to interact as well. And actually have them understand the language. They learn the language very quickly, you know, in spite of not having education. I think amongst all the refugee communities here in Malaysia, the Rohingya are the ones who pick up Malay the fastest. But of course, their level of Malay is not subtle, right? So they don't pick up the cultural subtleties, you know, they don't always understand like the Malay culture of minta izin dulu and, you know, all of this very kind of subtle, you know, gestures and cultural subtleties. So I think that they as well needs to be educated in that. And I think if we, you know, if we want them to understand that, we need to invest in that. We need to really be able to invest in that communication and that type of engagement.
Thanks Lillian. That's great, because I really think that, you know, it's actually conversations that change people's minds and people's hearts most of the time. And I wish you all the best with this really important project this year. Andika, I just want to get back to you actually on the topic of documentation, right? So a big issue with why, you know, the problem facing our migrant workers is precisely because such a large amount of them are not documented. So could you explain a little to our audience today on why is it that documentation is so difficult or so problematic, or, you know, what is it that's actually preventing, you know, a proper documentation system for our migrant workers?
Okay, thanks, Aira. Wow. Okay, so there are actually, so let's start with the figures. We, as I earlier mentioned, that the estimates about between 3 and 5 millions. I just put it simply, between 3 and 5 millions. And we don't know how many undocumented, but we know certainly that documented based on the labor force survey, or maybe data from the Ministry of Human Resources, for example, based on the working pass, issued by immigration, about 2 million. So let's say about 3 million undocumented migrant workers. And the reason for people being undocumented, many. So let's start from when they are being recruited, right? So when they are being recruited, there's always this problem on unethical recruitment practices by the labor agencies that involve in recruiting migrant workers. And once they are recruited, let's say, for example, give you one migrant worker from Lombok Timur, for example, or maybe one from Dhaka, and they are recruited, or maybe one in Kathmandu, but they are recruited somewhere else within the 75 district in Nepal, for example. And the labor recruiter cheated about the employment contract, right? Or maybe not informing the entire contents of the employment contract, saying that you will be working in palm oil factory, there's Econ, and you sign the agreement and you agree, and then you pass the pre-departure orientation program, and you pass that, and you pass also medical, and you will be arriving in Malaysia. Once they arrive in Malaysia, they are legal, yeah? So basically by documentation, they are legal. They arrive in Malaysia, and they found out that actually they are working in palm, but not in factory, but they're actually working palm, but in estate. Completely different story. So they were not given the full information about what they will be working in Malaysia. So once they arrive in Malaysia, they are documented, and they found that they're being cheated because there was unethical recruitment practices happen during the recruitment process, and they were not satisfied, for example, and not satisfied and wanting to change the employment, and they ran away because they don't satisfied, they ran away. So when they ran away or absconded from the employer, looking for other job, and maybe they don't know, the implication is that you can't renew your working pass. You can still have your passport, and you don't have your working pass because you can't renew. In order for you to renew your working pass, you need employer. Now your working pass has different name of the employer. So now you're becoming undocumented workers. So that's only one example, but there are many other reasons telling us that when they are recruited, they are legal, but because of unethical recruitment practices, they arrive in Malaysia and they turn into undocumented migrant. This is very light issue. So we are not talking about people in debt bondage or cheated, impose a lot of cost of recruitment, and when they arrive in Malaysia, they have to repay that. So there was a deduction of wages happening when they arrive in Malaysia, when they're working. And also at the same time, if you're working in the agri sector, for example, in the palm sector, for example, or palm oil estate somewhere around remote area, and that's where the company or the employer, for example, has already agreement with the labor recruiters in your origin country, make sure that you will deduct the salary every month, for example, 500 until you finish the debt. And that's where another indicator of forced labor happening, and the workers run away. So a lot of other reasons that actually making people being undocumented even when they arrive, they are documented. Of course, also there's another group of migrant workers. When they arrive in Malaysia, they arrive or using irregular channel. That also happened. So you can see that quite obvious, especially in the east part of Sabah, in Tawau, Sandakan, Lahada, to where people can easily cross the border, and there's a smuggling ring and trafficking. To some extent, there were trafficking ring that actually facilitate your travel, and there were element of exploitation, and that's where the case turned from smuggling into trafficking. So that happened. So I think the reasons for documentation or being undocumented many, and at the same time, I guess our policy looks like one size fits all. And I guess that needs to be changed, because I guess that's why also the same with the issue with refugees. I don't think we should have something in terms of the policy design and implication. I guess it shouldn't have the an approach of the silver bullet, try to target everything in one framework. I guess for the migrant workers. So no, the second point, reflecting to your question, I guess in the current situation, because the government put on hold on new recruitment. So there will be no migrant workers being recruited from countries where we blacklisted, including Indonesia. I guess Bangladesh, India also blacklisted because of COVID-19. And I guess, and at the same time, you know that many industries are relying too much on the migrant workers. And now they can't recruit. And there's already a demand from the sector needing the migrant workers, but they can't do that because of the the holding by the government for recruitment. So what happens? They're recruiting undocumented workers, and that also what happened in Sabah, where people try to smuggle people to work, especially in the plantation sector. Plantation sector, about 80% relying on migrant workers. And once you stop the recruitment, what happens with the labor shortage in the sector? And they need to, start the operation, continue the operation. So the only potential for now, I guess, we also know that there's a labor shortage and there's a demand from the sector. And we also know at the same time, we have this pool of talents that we could actually recruit. So maybe a short-term intervention by the government is to reintroduce again the rehiring program or legalization program, or whatever they call it. Sometimes they combine it with amnesty. So whatever it is, you need to provide opportunity for those already in the country to start working or to be recruited by the employer, so that you can, number one, legalize them. Number two, in that term, legalize them in terms of their documentation. At the same time, also avoid the recruitment of irregular workers coming into Malaysia, because we know companies are desperate. They need workers, otherwise you're gonna collapse. You can't do that. So I guess the short-term intervention is to start the rehiring program and leverage. In fact, if we want to start the pilot, allowing the, for example, refugees to start working, of course, not one size fits all again, because there was already a pilot study in the plantation sector and it didn't work well because of maybe it's too far from UNHCR office. They can't do all the UN stuff and all that. Maybe there are other sectors, maybe in service sectors, that you can start exploring.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Andika. Yeah, I think we're approaching the end of our webinar. So I think I'm just going to just sort of have some concluding remarks, which I think is, some of the important points that's been brought up today by our two speakers, which is, I think, firstly, a one-size-fits-all approach, doesn't work. And there needs to be, deeper thought on specific kind of policies for, specific groups of either migrant workers or refugees, and so on. And secondly, I think, touching again on what Lilian said about, a truly multi-stakeholder approach to the issue, because no one party can handle the issue of refugees on their own, not the government, not civil society, but it really needs to be thought of as a collective approach by many different parties. And I think, Andika has shared a lot of the barriers to why it is so difficult to actually document migrant workers that come into the country. And I feel like there is almost like a domino effect, right? When workers come into the country and then become undocumented, and then there is and then now the government's approach of halting the taking in of more workers, which then exacerbates the need from industries such as the agriculture industry of workers, which then acts as a barrier to the sort of what they can produce, and then which then has implications, of course, on food supply and so on. So so these are complex issues, but I think a different approach, I think, probably is needed by several different stakeholders. So thank you very much, actually, both Lilian and also to Andika, for sharing some very important thoughts in tonight's webinar. We didn't have time for questions this evening, but I think that's okay, because I think what you both have shared tonight is very enlightening, and I think I learned a lot as well from tonight's exchange. So thank you very much to the both of you. I will be in touch in the future if you have any future ideas work on either refugees or migrant workers, as I think you both know it's a topic of great interest to us at Ideas. So thank you very much to both of you, and hopefully we'll see each other again in real life soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, Lilian.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, Lilian. Bye, Andika. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.